It's recorded in Genesis chapter 19, I believe it is, there about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So we're going to read the New Testament story about, and Jesus is actually talking about the end times and his return. So Luke chapter 17, beginning with verse 26. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so also will it be in the days of the Son of Man. People were eating, drinking, marrying, and being given in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. It was the same in the days of Lot. People were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all. It will be just like this on the day the Son of Man is revealed. On that day no one who is on the roof of his house with his goods inside should go down to get them. Likewise no one in the field should go back for anything. And here are three words that I'm basing my whole message on this morning. Remember Lot's wife. And he says it as an exclamation. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever tries to keep his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life will preserve it. I tell you, on that night, two people will be in one bed, and one will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding grain together. One will be taken and the other left. Where, Lord? They asked. He replied, where there is a dead body, there the vultures will gather. In other words, you'll know because you'll see the signs. If you see vultures gathering, you know there's a dead body someplace. I read about this somewhere, and it said that actually it's amazing. There won't be a vulture around. You couldn't see one anywhere. You'd never spot one. But if something dies, it's only a very, very short time until they appear. And they'll be circling. And you can just about tell where the carcass of the dead animal is by those vultures circling around. So Jesus gives information about his second coming. And he gives information about the end times. And some people believe that this is also information about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. But there are three words here. I spent most of the week working on this message because this thought kept coming to my mind where Jesus said, remember Lot's wife. And as I worked on this and thought about putting it into a message, of course, naturally, a preacher, you want to, as a pastor, when you're preparing a message, you want to say things in a way that's easy for people to remember. That's why preachers usually say 1, 2, 3, or they say, okay, here's point 1, here's point 2, here's point 3, or whatever number it is, or they use some kind of alliteration to make the points sound about the same, so that people remember. Because we're well aware that you probably only remember about 10% of what you hear. That's true anytime you listen to somebody speak. So it's not too flattering to know that when you preach a sermon on Sunday morning and spend about 30 minutes preaching it or longer, that people are probably only going to remember about 3 or 4 minutes of it. They're not going to remember very much. But when we think about, and so I spent most of the week preparing this, and then last night the Lord gave me this outline that was so much simpler than the one that I had planned. So I guess I'm going to use parts of both of them, but I think you'll remember this, leisure. But these three words, remember Lot's wife, tell us amazing things. I mean, just those three words, remember Lot's wife. Anybody that's read the Bible knows what that means. Anybody that knows about the stories of the Old Testament understands just with those three words, remember Lot's wife. And Jesus is saying that. Jesus is reminding his disciples and all those who are listening to him that there's judgment coming at the end of time as well. He says, remember Lot's wife. And what do you think about when you hear those words, remember Lot's wife? What comes into your mind? What would you think about if Jesus were to say to you, if He were to be able to come here right now or come to your home sometime and just be talking to you, carrying on a conversation, and He said to you, remember Lot's wife? You'd think, well, why is He saying that to me? What do I need to think about? We all know the story. Richard read it again to us. It's one of the first stories in the Old Testament. In the very first book of the Old Testament. It's a story about judgment. It's a story about the disastrous consequences of sin. But it's more than that, because when you hear those words, remember Lot's wife, the thing is, can anybody tell me Lot's wife's name? It's awfully quiet in here. What was her name? We don't know, do we? We don't know. How would you like it if a story was told about you and they never told your name? You might think to yourself, well, I guess I'm not very important, am I? Well, her name is not mentioned in the story in Genesis. Her name is not mentioned by Jesus. As far as I know, her name is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. Now, if she had done something great, I think her name would be remembered, don't you? I think if she had done some amazing thing, some great act of faith, some great expression of love, some wonderful thing, I think we'd have her name. We don't remember her name because, it's sad to say, the only importance of even mentioning her name is tragedy. Tragedy to her family, tragedy to herself, and tragedy to two sinful cities. So, when we hear those words, remember Lot's wife, we're reminded of some things. And you might think a lot of things, but I'm going to just mention 3 things that God gave to me about this. We are reminded of a wicked city, or 2 wicked cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. How wicked were these cities? We really don't fully know. But when you read the story, you have to say to yourself, that would be a terrible, terrible place to live. Don't you think? When you hear about Sodom and Gomorrah, just to mention the name Sodom, the word sodomy comes from the name of the city, Sodom. Sodom and Gomorrah. In the whole story, you have to read a lot more than just this one section of Genesis. You have to go on back to the story of God telling Abraham that he and Sarah, in their old age, were going to have a son, finally. God had promised that the whole world would be blessed through his seed and through his family, and he didn't have a family. He didn't have any children. And so he's getting up in years, and he's probably just about giving up hope. And Abraham, being a great man of faith, as he was, especially later on, we see his remarkable faith, and I'm sure that the situation about the birth of a son increased his faith. But you remember, before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, God had come, and he'd come down in the form of an angel, and said to Abraham, you're going to have, next year at this time, you're going to have a son. And you remember how it was just something that was just beyond belief, because Abraham said he and his wife were really too old to have children. She said, well, I'm beyond the childbearing age. It would require a miracle for this to happen. And she laughed about it. And whether she was laughing because of her lack of faith, or whether she was laughing at just the thought, because she said, could I possibly have this enjoyment, this kind of pleasure now, after I'm beyond the normal age of child rearing? And you remember God mentioned to her that she that she had said that she lied and said she didn't, or that she had laughed. And in the context of all of this, and God saying to Abraham and Sarah, you're going to have a son, the world is going to be blessed, I'm going to keep my promise that I made to you, and even though it seems impossible, it's going to happen. And then he said, well, since Abraham is going to be the father of many nations, these angels who were sent to tell him about this said, well, shouldn't we also let Abraham know that Sodom and Gomorrah, where his nephew lives, are such wicked cities that they are ripe for the judgment of God. They have gone on in their sinful ways and have gotten so wicked that these cities are ripe for the judgment of God. And let me remind you that God never judges someone immediately when they sin. If He did, none of us would be here this morning, right? If you had been struck dead the first time you sinned, you wouldn't be here, right? And I wouldn't be either. Or even the second or third or fourth or fifth time you sinned. God is a God of mercy. God is a God of grace. And He always gives time for people to repent. He gave years and years while Noah was building the ark, and Noah is called a preacher of righteousness in the New Testament. So we know that Noah was telling the people and warning them that judgment was coming, but they didn't believe it. And so all the time that it took him to build the ark, he was telling people what was going to happen, and they laughed at him. They didn't believe it. They mocked him. But when it finally started to rain and it was too late, and Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives and all the animals were in the ark, and it was sealed up, and it began to rain, and as the waters got higher and higher, and they'd never seen anything like that before, they finally believed, but it was too late. Jesus mentions that when he's saying, remember Lot's wife. He talks about Noah. He says it'll be like it was in the days of Noah. And then he says, that tells about Sodom and Gomorrah. And then he says, remember Lot's wife. And when we remember Lot's wife, we are reminded of these wicked cities and how terrible it was and what terrible sin was there. And, you wonder sometimes today about the wickedness that goes on in some cities in our world today, don't you? That God doesn't destroy them. Do you really believe this happened? Do you think this is an actual happening, or is this just a fairy tale? Is it just a story to try to teach us some lessons? It is something that really happened, because Jesus would not have brought it up, and He didn't bring it up as a story. He brought it up as an event that happened. Remember Lot's wife. Remember what happened. Remember those wicked cities. And so we are reminded of 2 very wicked cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. Apparently sexual sin was rampant in these cities. You know from reading the story. Go back and read the stories. I'm not going to go into all the gory details of it. I may read a short passage from that. But the cities were wicked enough that God had decided, I'm going to destroy them. So when we hear the words, remember Lot's wife, we're reminded of a wicked city. We are also reminded of the cost of disobedience when we hear those words, remember Lot's wife. What happened to her? We probably all know. If you've read the Old Testament, you know what happened to Lot's wife. For some reason, and you try to put yourself in her position. Somebody comes to your house and says, and they're angels that came to her house. And they say, and we know from what happened and from the previous events that these were angels that God sent to do this work. And while they were there, they were standing on the outside of the door. The men of the city had seen them come in. These are some strangers. that had come that they hadn't seen before. They all gather around. After they get in the house and they come and they knock on the door and they say, send those men out. We want to have sex with them. That's basically what it says. And Lot says, no, that'd be a horrible thing. These are visitors in my home. That's terrible. And they're going to break the door down. They said, we're going to break the door down and we're going to take care of you too. They're probably planning to kill him or hurt him badly. And they were struck with blindness, the men that were trying to do this. So they didn't get in. But they spent the night there, and the next morning they went out of the city. They're going, and they're just warned in a simple way. In fact, they didn't really they weren't getting ready to leave quickly enough. And so it says that they grabbed them by the hands. And also, there were two daughters. And those daughters were already engaged to be married. They were already given to a couple of young men that they hadn't been with them yet, but they were planning to marry them. I don't know what age these daughters were at that time. But they were planning to be married. And so the young men were also told, and they had the opportunity to leave. And they joked about it. They didn't believe it. Read the story. You've probably read that. But if you don't remember that part, go back and read it. And then it says that they told them to hurry because the judgment of God is ripe for these cities and it's coming. And we want to get you out of the cities. We want to get you away from here. And so he had to actually take them by the hand and they said, now we're going. We're leaving the place. Don't look back. So think about this. Lot's wife, however long they've lived there, I don't know. But if you had to just pick up and leave your home, and you couldn't take anything with you, and you were told everything here is going to be destroyed, and you know that all the possessions that you have had over a lifetime up to that point are going to be destroyed. Even if you were living in a wicked place, you might be kind of sad about it, right? You might say to yourself, well, she should have been glad to be getting away from a terrible place like that. But somehow there was something in her heart that she wasn't willingly leaving the city that was going to be destroyed. And the angel took him by the hand and said, don't look back. Just a simple command told to her, don't look back. He didn't say what would happen if you do look back. He just said, don't look back. Now, I guess you could say it was almost like you think about your children. Sometimes you give them quick commands, and whether they obey or don't obey could be a matter of life or death, couldn't it? And you don't have time to make a lot of explanations. And with little kids, you just tell them simple things. Don't run out in the road. And if they're about to do something that's hurtful, you try to stop them. You just say something quickly. And if they don't obey, it could be a matter of life and death, couldn't it? So they were simply told, don't look back. But there was something about these cities that was appealing to Lot's wife. And as they were going away, she did look back. And she died because she looked back. I guess you might say she was being taken out of Sodom, but Sodom was not out of her. That she was being taken out of this wicked city, but the wickedness of that city was not really out of her. In other words, she looked back. It's almost like she longed to go back there, even though she was warned of what was going to happen. And it should be a message to us about the danger of disobeying God. If you believe that God is who the Bible says He is, and that He not only sees us right where we are now, but He knows our past and He knows our future. If you believe that God is omnipotent, and that He's omnipresent, and that He's omniscient, and that God can see into the future, if you believe that, because we can't see into the future, can we? We don't know what's going to happen. Don't you want that kind of a God to be guiding you and helping you for the future? Don't you want Him to be leading you? Because He sees things you don't see. He knows things you don't know. He knows things that lie ahead in your pathway that you don't know are there. And He's able to help you if you follow Him. But not being obedient, then it could be a matter of life or death. Oh, well, it doesn't matter if I do this or that. God has said this, but that doesn't seem like it's going to be much problem if I do that. Just one look back. What harm could that do? After all, she was leaving all of her belongings, and she was leaving a city where she'd probably lived for several years. She looked back, and she died because of it. Remember, Lot's wife reminds us of the cost of disobedience. And then these three words also remind us of the wrath of God against sin. The wording is so picturesque and so descriptive in these passages, it's quite amazing. But these three words, remember Lot's wife, remind us of the wrath of God against sin. And we see it other places in the Old Testament. As I mentioned, we see it when God destroyed the world through a flood. In Noah's day, it was said of Noah that he was an unusual person because he was a righteous man among the people of his time. And it says that the hearts of all the people had turned away from God. And everybody living on the earth had become corrupt and sinful in the way they were living. Do you ever look around at our world today and think it's about like that? So much corruption and so much sin. But you know what happens when you get used to living in a place where there's sin? You kind of become hardened to it a little bit. If you could bring somebody back from the dead that died when television first came out back in the 40s or 50s or whatever it was, the old black and white televisions and the things that came on, the programs that came on, Roy Rogers and the Lone Ranger and all kinds of things. Oh, sure, there was some shooting and stuff, but there wasn't any blood and there wasn't any profanity and people weren't jumping in bed with each other, making all kinds of references to sex and just all the stuff. But you know, over the years, people have become tolerant to those things, become hardened to those things, and we watch things on television that should be embarrassing to us. And I've sat in people's homes while I was trying to visit with them, and they just so used to the TV being on that they just leave it on while I was there. And sometimes I would actually have to ask, could we turn the TV down a little bit? Because we couldn't, because they keep asking me what I'm saying. They can't hear me, but yet they don't think about turning the TV down because it's just to have it on all the time. And I've sat in people's homes when things came on that were embarrassing. And they didn't think much about it. But we've become hardened. And I suppose living in that wicked place with all the sin all around, she's just become used to it. She's just gotten used to it. We've gotten used to hearing people swear. The vulgar four-letter words. Gail and Krista and I were on our way to, one time we took the bus because it was less expensive. We took the bus to go to, I believe we went all the way to North Dakota on a bus. It was a long trip. It was interesting. You see some interesting things when you ride the bus, especially that far and all the places you stop in between. And the bus stops a lot. But on the way back, two young people sat a few seats behind us. And they were very loud and rowdy. And they were just using all kinds of expletives and terrible, the F word, and all the terrible, worst language you can think about. And it was so common as a part of the vocabulary that they apparently didn't even think anything about it. And Krista was just a little girl at the time. And I remember getting up and going to the bus driver and saying, could you please ask these people to not use all this profanity? And he did, and I don't remember. It doesn't seem like it helped a whole lot. They got a little better, but then they started up again. It was just so common, so second nature to them to just use all of this kind of language. And I know you know what I'm talking about, because if you're around people, sometimes our military people have to put up with this. And I had a man in my church that was in the Air Force. in one church where I was. And I'd never heard the man use a curse word. And one day, his wife was complaining, and she said, Mike swears all the time. I said, what? He swears all the time. Yeah, he uses terrible language. And he said, well, all the men around me do, and in order to fit in, I have to talk that way. And he claimed to be a Christian. And I've heard the same thing come from some other people. And sometimes people excuse it by saying, oh, well, everybody does it. And I heard a statistic the other day that was kind of amazing to me also. The percentage of adults that are married in the United States of America is constantly dropping and dropping and dropping. And it's down to like 52%. Only 52% of adults are married. Now, of course, you could say, well, there are a lot of single adults, their spouses have died, they're widowers. Yes. But there are also a lot of people that don't think it's necessary to get married anymore. They just shack up with somebody for a while. Then if they want to change, they go shack up with somebody else for a while. They just live with somebody without being married, have sex with them. And it's become so common that we've got so used to it that television is just about that. The movies are about that. And we don't think much about it. But when Jesus is telling his disciples and people around him about the end times, he says, remember Lot's wife. We're reminded of those wicked cities. We're reminded of the cost of disobedience. It cost her life. And we're reminded of the wrath of God against sin. He destroyed those cities. And if you read on down, and I think maybe Richard read the part that talks about this, it talks about Abraham going out the next morning. And you'll remember, Lot was blessed to have Abraham as his uncle. Why? Because Abraham interceded for Lot. And Abraham may have been the reason that Lot's life was spared. Because when Abraham heard that Sodom and Gomorrah were going to be destroyed, he thought to himself, my nephew's down there and his family. And he began to talk to God. He said, God, Lot lives down there. Would you destroy the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people down there? Would you save the city? And God in his mercy said, yes, if I can find 50 righteous people down there. Of course, God knows all things, but but Abraham doesn't. And God says, yes, if there are 50 righteous people there, I'll spare the city. And Abraham is so bold, he continues to intercede for his nephew and his family. And he says, what if they're 45? What if they're 40? What if they're... And he gets all the way down to 10. And to show you how merciful and gracious God is before he destroys people, even in the terrible sin that they were living in, God said yes, even to 10. If there are just 10 righteous people in those cities, I won't destroy them. And apparently they weren't. Because the angel showed up the night before they destroyed the cities and spent the night. They were going to spend the night outside, and Lot convinced them to spend the night inside. The next morning, and they were let out of the city, and the cities were destroyed. And it says that God rained sulfur or fire and brimstone down upon those cities. Now, do you think God is able to do that? Do you believe that that's an actual happening? I do. I believe that's what really happened. Now, have you read recently in the papers? There's some concern about terrible storms in the atmosphere. I'm talking about storms where, not storms we think about of rain and thunder and lightning. I'm talking about storms of meteorites and that kind of thing coming out of the atmosphere. I read this just recently on the internet. But the next morning, after God had destroyed those cities, it says Abraham went out and looked, and he said the smoke, he saw the smoke coming up from those cities. They were completely destroyed. Everybody living there was destroyed. It was the intercessory prayer of Abraham that spared Lot and his wife. Well, his wife was killed because she looked back but his daughters were saved. But the wrath of God is something we're reminded of when we hear those words. Remember Lot's wife. So we need to take seriously the examples of God's judgment in the Bible, because it's coming again in the end times. Read the book of Revelation. It talks about the plagues. It talks about the opening of the seals. It talks about the things that are coming on this world in the end times. And so Jesus is saying to you, and he's saying to me, remember Lot's wife. Don't be disobedient. Be faithful.